This week on the Futurists, what happens after the wrecking ball? With Brett King and Rob Tercek.
When it comes to what's going to happen next in terms of technology-based unemployment, Musk has been talking about it for many years now, talking about universal basic income. Bill Gates is saying we have to tax robots and AI so that we can pay for UBI. But we've seen nothing in Congress trying to figure out how we might make that transition to this type of society. You've got technology going like this in terms of its capacity to inflict change on society, and policy is sort of like barely moving.
Hey there, welcome back to the Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and my buddy Brett King is joining me for a special edition where we sort through the wreckage of what used to be Western civilization.
Seriously, Rob, it's like, often we get asked as futurists what our predictions for the future are. And of course, we talk about the fact that we don't predict the future, we forecast and, so forth. But a follow-up to the Great Depression, it wasn't on my bingo card for this year. But it's very interesting to sort of look at this environment right now. And I'm amazed at how many commentators on the right think that tariffs might just work this time, when essentially never have trade wars ever really, given any advantage. I mean, the Smoot-Hawley Act, we know that was a key element in the Depression, the 1930s Depression. And, we have got literally dozens of trade wars based on tariffs, from pre-20th century, such as the Opium Wars, the Byzantine-Bulgarian War, through to the Banana Wars of the late 1890s, the German-Polish Customs War, the Chicken War, which was a US versus EU battle in the 1960s, and then in the 21st century, Canada, Australia, with a salmon trade dispute. Wherever we look historically, trade wars like this have ended in grief for all of the economies that participated in it. So it's like we have hundreds of years of economic evidence that trade wars don't work. So my question, I guess, that I'd like to explore is, given that very clear economic evidence, why people like Peter Navarro and others suggesting to Trump that this is a good idea? What is the motivation right now when the US economy was actually doing very well? We had the lowest unemployment in, decades. Obviously there was the debt imbalance and the debt problem to fix, but the US economy was in pretty good health. So why take it off the rails like this with, the stock market crash and so forth? What has to be the motivation? That's sort of really what I'd like to get into with you today.
Yeah, and after you erase $5 trillion of American wealth in one weekend, you better have a pretty good plan for an outcome that's going to restore that plus more, right? And that's what we're not hearing about. Like, there does not seem to be a plan. There doesn't seem to be a clear vision of the aftermath. It's like, well, let's take a wrecking ball to this really magnificent edifice and of global trade, and let's find out what happens next. After we wreck it, we'll figure that out. We'll put the pieces back together. I mean, in a way, this is like Elon Musk's approach to dealing with Twitter. We're going to just take out a wrecking ball. We'll blow the thing up, and don't worry about it. We'll figure it out later. Okay, that works if you're the richest guy in the world because you can afford the losses. But that's not really the situation here. The United States borrows a lot of money, and we have to fund the government in some fashion, even if they radically cut, overhead, which they're attempting to do, but they're not going to get anywhere close to their $1 trillion target. It remains an open question. Like, so what element of the economy is going to be thriving after this to fund all this change and the rebuild? And that is an entirely open question. I don't think there's anyone on either party in the United States who's got a good answer for it. And we're getting plenty of feedback from around the world that this is an extremely poor idea. This is a very bad idea to embark on this.
I mean, the sort of commentary that frustrates me is, oh, people are going to bend the knee and come to Trump and cave on the tariff situation. This is not a functional, even if that was to happen, this is still not a functional solution to the core
Right.
problems in the US economy. If you look at what created this disparity, it was the offshoring of production facilities. And it's going to take trillions of dollars to onshore that capacity back into the US. And we're not going to have, like Vietnam, who was given, what is it, 45% tariffs the other day. That they're manufacturing clothes. They can't buy, US products at volume because they're not affluent enough at
Yeah.
the core level of the economy, and so you're going to have a trade imbalance there, whatever happens. Now, do Americans really want to be going into factories making socks and t-shirts at 4 to 5 times the cost of what it costs to get them
Yeah.
from Vietnam? That's not reasonable. So you say, all right, well, let's do robotic factories. And, we're going to create construction jobs with that and robotic jobs and so forth, for that. But we're not actually inserting that into the economy like in the way it was during the sort of Henry Ford production line era, where people went into factories and that really stimulated the middle class.
Hmm.
It's not clear that bringing these factories back into the US is going to create the sort of jobs that the US can field. First of all,
It's
we
a really
don't
good point.
have enough
You're making a
STEM
couple good
graduates,
points there. The countries we're trying to extract something from aren't in a position to buy a lot of American goods. It's not just Vietnam. That's true for all those African countries that just got whacked with massive tariffs as
Mm,
well. So they kind of took a ham-fisted approach or a very unsophisticated approach to calibrating is where, there might be a case or an argument for a fine-tune tariff. That's how they've been used typically in the past to identify a specific issue, usually one that surfaces at the World Trade Organization, and they use the tariff as kind of a scalpel. This isn't a scalpel.
no.
This isn't even a butcher's knife. This is just a sledgehammer. So that there's
It's
a
an
lack of precision
economic
there.
thermonuclear war. That's what it is.
Exactly. And then the second issue is like, who's going to build a factory right now with the level of uncertainty that we have right now? And with Trump,
Exactly.
how many more years is he going to be alive, let alone president? 3, 4 max, right? Nobody in the right mind is going to say, oh, yeah, on the basis of this, I'm going to go invest $1 billion and build a robotic factory in the United States. And then the third point you made there is robot factories don't necessarily create very many jobs. So the
Yeah.
kind of manufacturing that Trump is thinking about, this sort of mythological version in the 1950s or something, that's gone and it's dead and done. It doesn't exist anywhere. Right now in China,
There are ways
half the
they could.
robots in the world are in factories in
Yeah.
China. They're doubling down on this, on
Oh, yeah.
automated manufacturing. We're nowhere near. We're not even in that game.
No, I mean, there are ways we could have done this. We could have prepared for this with, let's say, free STEM education across the board. We could have given big tax breaks to corporations building autonomous production plants in the US. That would have been a tax break even the Democrats probably would have supported. And then we could have used the tariffs in line with that strategically or surgically to create incentives for specific industries. That would have
Mhm.
been an approach that could have led
That's
to better
that.
onshoring.
What you're describing is what the Chips Act that Biden introduced. That's what the Chips Act was designed to do, and in many respects, it was successful. It's now it's being bashed daily by the right wing in the United States, but that's just because it was Biden's idea or his initiative.
Yeah.
The Chips Act was designed to get America back in the chips game in the semiconductor business. And there are a bunch of strategic reasons for us having onshore semiconductor manufacturing because we want to, mitigate the risk of having manufacturing in Taiwan. And so it was actually a strategic move as
Right.
well. And it was surgical in the sense that it was only aimed at that one industry, so it wasn't going to distort the whole economy. Unfortunately, that's not what we have
Put
here. Here,
tariffs on Taiwan.
oh yeah, no, it's
You know.
the well, and guess who didn't get the tariffs? Like, Russia and North
Yeah.
Korea. Now, what does
Yeah.
that tell you? Like, that's
I don't know how much North Korea exports to the United States or vice versa, but for Russia,
got a huge
certainly
amount of
it's an
trade
issue.
happening there.
Yeah.
But it is a
Yeah.
little bit weird that Trump whacks our allies the hardest, and he does it every single time. And to me, there's nothing strategic here. This is what a bully does. A bully hits the people that
Yeah.
are nearest to him, and the ones he knows he can get away with it. He's not really looking for a fight with a fair rival. He's looking for a fight with somebody he knows he can beat. And unfortunately,
Yeah.
Canada and Mexico, this is like as much as we have tension in some respects with immigration and coming from the South, the big picture of the 20th century and 21st century with Mexico and Canada is actually a fantastic collaboration. These are not defended borders. These are borders
Yeah.
where trade and commerce flow freely. Just the example of American auto manufacturing, it's really North American auto manufacturing because the parts move freely across the borders.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
employs millions of people or hundreds of thousands of workers at least. And now this has all been disabled. It's going to actually drive up the cost of an automobile in the United States. An American car is going to cost a lot more because of all the imported quality. Yeah, the other weird thing here is we've kneecapped champions. So Apple stock famously got crushed. It went down 17% at one point, and that is because poor Apple, they've been trying to diversify out of Chinese manufacturing since the last Trump administration. And now they have set up all these factories in places like Vietnam. And lo and behold, they're going to get whacked with tariffs. The cost of an iPhone is going to go up by an estimated $300 per phone. So if an iPhone costs $1,000 today, it's going to be a $1,300 phone tomorrow. Not because it's a better phone, not because of some new cool technology, not because of any innovation whatsoever, just because of these
Just
completely
because. Yeah,
arbitrary tariffs that have
exactly.
been imposed. So that's
Well,
that's
this
inflation. I
is
mean, that's a significant
yeah.
driver of inflation, and I don't think most people have got their heads wrapped around this. The tariff is a tax. It's the single largest tax hike in American history, and that hasn't fully landed yet because we haven't seen the price increases.
Now there is some interesting elements to this. The yield curve is down, which could make U.S. Treasury bills more affordable, which could be a good thing for the debt imbalance. But to do that at the cost of U.S. businesses and the U.S. stock market is a huge risk. The US dollar in this situation, it will tend to do a little better because there's a flight to the reserve currency from a security perspective. Gold's probably going to do quite well. Bitcoin's struggling a bit today, but, could be seen as a hedge there. We'll have to sort of see what happens. Cameron Winklevoss, commented on this the other day that, we sort of saw a dislocation of Bitcoin from the market, but then today Bitcoin's taken a pretty big hit, or last night. Bitcoin took a pretty big hit. So the rules, the rules of what we have seen happening historically in respect to, trade wars like this, we are seeing a lot of those trends sort of repeating themselves in terms of instability. But, my question is, why is this happening now? And my theory is twofold. Right, I think one is that it could be something as simple as a pump and dump scheme at a global level in terms of stock and trade. That
Explain what you
there's
mean before you go to the second one. Tell us what you mean by the pump and dump.
So, what you have, this is sort of a classic terminology in stock trading where you have someone visibly pump up a stock, to raise the price of a stock. And then, once it's exposed that it's all smoke and mirrors, the stock value plummets. The
They sell at
alternative
the
to that
high, leave
is,
everybody else
yeah,
holding the bag.
yeah. Exactly. The alternative to that is you dump on the market, something that lowers the value, incredibly, and then you buy in at the low point when everyone is skittish about the stock. So that's
Right. This is what the
that's the
speculators
first
did in the
effect.
19th century with the stock market. It was like a game, right? They
Right.
would spread misinformation and drive prices up or down and
Exactly.
then play the opposite. So
Yes.
you think
What is
that's a
it? Buy,
possibility
buy on
here?
rumor, sell on fact, right? Yeah,
And so,
it's a possibility, right?
right.
Because, you have a bunch of, a bunch of people in there that, theoretically have the capability to really move the market, when it's at its low point. But the other element in terms of why now, in terms of the timing, if you hear the communication coming out of the administration, it's all about China, 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 right? And how we're going to
China.
pull back China. Yeah,
Yeah.
pull back China, from their, how dare they think they can compete with the United States as an economy and so forth. And this is the last chance to stop China in their tracks and sort of basically teach them an economic lesson. Well, the problem with that is that China has been investing now for 10 years in infrastructure in places like Africa. Now, if you're an African, government, in the current scenario, even with the tariff situation here, are you more likely to align yourself with China, who's been investing in your ports and roads and airports and infrastructure over the last decade, or are you going to yield to the United States, who's now put this penalty of tariffs on you? This is the key problem that the US has. China's ability to respond to these tariff wars in terms of onshoring capacity that they don't have currently is far superior to the US. So if
Yeah.
this trade war is successful in achieving, what the administration thinks it can with China, China's ability to mobilize and reshape their economy currently is much better than the United States. So they're likely to come out of this significantly stronger. But
Yeah, I
there
think
is
that's a
a
really valid
theory
point.
that you collapse the yield curve and the debt that China's holding of the United States, they have less power over. So
Mhm.
this is sort of one of the outliers there, that this may be a sort of way to renegotiate the US national debt, which clearly has been something that Musk has been focused on very clearly over the last couple of years as something that has to change. But it really
But
can't
isn't it
change without the
self-defeating to do
functional
that?
shifts.
Isn't it like saying we're going to blow up this whole economy in order to renegotiate the debt? And maybe that's what's required. Maybe you have to take a hostage, but it's so a little strange to put a gun to your own head and say, "Oh, I'm going to blow this thing up in order to renegotiate." I have a hard time understanding why the Chinese would say fine with that. And bear in mind the
They won't,
context
of
for this.
course, right?
It's China has greatly surpassed the United States' ability to manufacture, but that's not all. China's capacity to manufacture rivals that of the entire world, certainly Europe and the United States combined. And they continue to double down investment where we're not investing anything in manufacturing. It's a tiny amount. The CHIPS Act, like I said, it took an act of Congress to even generate interest in onshoring chip manufacturing. That's just one aspect of manufacturing. Where in China, this is going on across the board. In the last 5 years, the Chinese government has redirected government investment and loans towards manufacturing and away from real estate, which is probably a really smart
Yeah.
move on the Chinese government's part. But that means that there's an enormous amount of capital available to deploy now in robotic factories, and they're going for it.
And the
And that's
US doesn't
internal to
have that
China. Like that,
capital.
that
Yeah.
is totally not
Yeah.
subject to any of the dynamics that we're talking about. Nothing this administration is doing, none of these tariffs are going to have any impact on that. And so while the United States is pissing off all of its allies and trading partners and blowing up the international trade policy, China is doubling down on its ability to export at low cost and continue to be the workshop for the world. I don't really see how this ends up
I w-
working well for us.
no. No, I don't. I don't see that either. I was at Necker Island with Richard Branson 1 week ago. As you know, we had a fintech event there, and I was invited to speak. And I talked with him about this. He was not very like this was pre the tariff announcement, but he saw this sort of stuff coming, and he was not very complimentary of the US's chances of fixing this problem without real structural reform in terms of really thinking about, what the future of the United States needs to look like and investing in that. And I think that's the key problem here is that you've got, and the other thing is that if you look at Taiwan is a huge risk because of China's aspirations there. But we were discussing that maybe China might not they might not go in militarily and take over Taiwan. What if they formed an economic alliance with Taiwan like the EU? Something like that is very possible that could really cut the US out from the chip side of things. And, China just launched a couple of fabrication facilities for chips in the last couple of months in China, things that they weren't supposed to be able to do for another few years, based on the CHIPS Act. So, as you say, China's responding to this in the way we would expect, with massive investment in, infrastructure inside China to be able to compete. And they've invested in a lot of countries in the region and across in Africa as well to encourage trade. And it seems like that's going to be, quite a smart move given the current environment.
Almost any way this comes out, China's going to be ahead because their production capacity is going to be increasing throughout this trade war, however long it lasts, where I don't see any American company making a decision to invest in the United States because of the uncertainty. We have such an uncertain environment, and as you point out, it's not just uncertainty, the crazy whim of a president that just wakes up one day and decides to issue an executive order. It's also the uncertainty of interest rates and the uncertainty of trade policy and the uncertainty of the inputs, right? Because of the tariffs. No one knows anything, so everybody is holding back on making a decision. Meanwhile, China's doubling down on investment, so they're going to move ahead while we are paralyzed with indecision. This I view as a real problem. The longer this persists, the worse that problem gets. Brett, give me a hopeful scenario. Like, what's the good outcome here? I find it kind of fanciful to launch a trade war and expect a good outcome for the reasons you said at the beginning of the show. The history suggests that there's never a good outcome. But what is it they expect to get? So one of the points you made is that if the yield curve goes down and treasuries get cheaper or the interest rates pay to go down, that may somehow reduce American the debt burden the United States has.
Well, if the US economy suddenly fires, then they could buy back some of that debt, but that's unlikely because if the sort of investment that's required, particularly in infrastructure to build autonomous factories, even the infrastructure bill that Biden introduced hasn't even made a dent in that sort of stuff. And as we've talked about on the show before, even the dock workers and the deal that was done with the dock workers to avoid automation in US docks shows that we're not really of a structural mindset to do that sort of level of automation for onshoring robotic factories and autonomous supply chain. So that's the risk. But the positive could be that it really does force a real structural rethink in terms of the way the US economy is going to compete. Because if this doesn't work, this is like the nuclear option to slow China down. And when this doesn't work, then it will have to be, we need real reform, and AI and, technology and robotics is going to be that, but we need to massively invest in that. But that means breaking, the control of, sort of incumbent, lobbying groups and things like that, in the US.
Okay, so that's a fundamentally undemocratic approach to having a discussion about national economic policy. Effectively, what this group is doing is they're saying, you know what, we're not asking for permission. We're just going to break the glass, and then we'll pick up the pieces afterwards, and they'll force it. It'll be a fait accompli, where now it's like we have to rebuild the economy in a new way, probably in a way that disempowers labor and labor unions, probably in a way that enriches a handful. So what it looks like to me coming out the other side of this in the scenario you said, the United States starts to look more like Brazil or Argentina, where a handful of families that are wealthy own everything and everybody else is working for the man and buying at the company store.
Let's play this out after the break, but, in terms of the different scenarios that are possible. But I certainly think, let's get into the thinking that AI, climate, quantum, all of these things that are coming for this sort of inflection point in human society, maybe that is triggering this, because maybe they know that there's sort of momentous changes coming in human society, and they're trying to grab as much control of the assets and wealth before.
Grab as many assets as you can. It's a smash and grab. Okay, folks, you're listening to The Futurist with me, Rob Tercek, and my co-host, Brett King. We're going to be right back after a short break. Don't go anywhere, because this is going to be a great conversation. Hey, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek with Brett King. And Brett, before the break, we were talking about the scenarios. Actually, we were trying to talk about possible positive scenarios, although we were struggling to come up with any. But you had a second thought about what this wrecking ball might achieve or what it might accomplish for a future economy. Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, this is sort of, as we discussed in the first half, this is sort of the economic thermonuclear option for trying to stop China and its economic process. Progress rather. We know that China on a purchasing power parity basis has already surpassed US GDP, and with their investment in the Belt and Road and energy sector and so forth, there's a fairly strong likelihood not only that they'll be able to compete with the US in the 2030s, but surpass the US, particularly with the looming debt cliff problem. We've talked about this on the show previously. But this is, as I say, the nuclear option. Now, if this doesn't work, it has to force a rethink in terms of what should the nature of the US economy be to compete with China. If we haven't been able to stop China, we as the West, and this as the thermonuclear option fails, then the only choice is to compete with China on their terms. And this means massive investment in rethinking infrastructure in the United States. I'm not talking about, $5 trillion of investment. I'm talking 20 or $30 trillion of investment over a number of years. I'm talking about upgrading transportation systems, the entire energy grid, sort of rethinking this and getting ready for a world of the smart economies, autonomous supply chain, AI-based systems and so forth. But that requires breaking the back of the lobbying groups and the oligopolies that have control over the sort of the industrial 20th century economy in the United States today. But it's going to take a shock like this to sort of make that restructuring happen, I think. Because
so it's like they set off a hand grenade.
Yep.
Now they're going to try to pick up the pieces after the war. Brett, here's a question for you, though. The country is already up. We're swimming up to our eyeballs in debt as a nation in the United States right now. That's at the heart of this issue. And what you're talking about is 20 or 30 trillion dollars of investment. Where will that come from? And what investor will trust the United States after this spectacular display of bad decision making? Who's going to feel confident about investing $20 trillion in the U.S. to reboot our economy?
Well, this is a point. And how do you do that in the current debt situation? One of the things we explored in the book, The Rise of Technosocialism, was is there a way to cancel out US national debt smartly? And what we played with was that as climate costs increase, as the economic loss from extreme weather events and climate increases, and we see the ballooning eco-refugee problem, there's a pretty good argument to sort of cancel all national debt to reinvest in solving those problems, right? So that could be something that not the current administration could champion, but a new administration coming out of this could say, let's get the world
That's a great idea if you're the debtor. It's not so great if you're the lender, on the other hand.
No, but this requires much more consensus-based operation, right? And I think, in a situation where, if you think about China doesn't want global instability and eco-refugees any more than the US does. So, there is, the investment that China's making in green energy, for example. I know there's a lot of criticism about their carbon output, but let's remember that a lot of the carbon output in China is producing goods that go to the West, right? So we can't blame them for that if we're buying all this stuff made in Chinese factories. But the rate of them retooling their energy systems is truly impressive. They deployed half of the world's solar energy last year alone. So they're getting ready for
something like 90% of the solar panels in the world as well. And they do it more cost effectively than any American company possibly can. So, one of the things that's interesting about the scenario you're raising is for that scenario to work, the United States would have to become more like China. You and I have debated about China in the past on several episodes, and you're very bullish about China's economic prospects. I get that. And I've always been very skeptical about China as a governing, as a government. I wouldn't want to be a citizen of a country that was that controlling. So we've had that conversation going on. But what's happening in the United States right now, in parallel,
is getting closer to China as an autocratic system, right?
It's becoming a kind of a mix, like a blend of autocracy and democracy. And already we've kind of, our current president has neutralized Congress. They're functionally ineffective. A lot of what Congress power held as power to check the president has been ceded to the president, to the
It's just
executive branch.
executive orders. Yeah, yeah.
And now he's also he's got the Supreme Court on his side, and some would speculate that he's got some measure of control over the judiciary. I'm not so sure if that's true, but nevertheless, what you're seeing is a concentration of power in the hands of one man, who's backed by the richest man on the planet, who has already indicated that he's willing to spend an unlimited amount of money to back candidates in for Congress, whether it's for the House or Senate. If there are people sitting in the Senate today or in the House that do not comply with Trump's wishes, then they're going to get primaried by a Trump supporter, by a MAGA person in the future. And Musk has made it clear he'll spend an unlimited amount of money to do that. So you've got power and money combined. And don't forget that the people who were invited to President Trump's inauguration were among the richest people in the United States. So you had sort of like a parade of oligarchs in the United States. And this is a very
Mm.
un-American kind of concept that oligarchs are there
Yeah.
at the White House celebrating with the president. But it does look an awful lot like Russia and China. And so it seems to me is that as we are in this kind of
The tech
battle,
bros have fallen into line, right? Like, look at
100%.
Zuckerberg. I mean, Tim Cook has been a bit quieter, though they did cave on some elements, although they have protected diversity. But Chamath, and others, seeing their sort of turnabout in terms of their communication is. Bending the knee to the administration is pretty
Yeah.
shocking. Now,
So you got big capital and big
yeah,
tech, and of course the banks are falling into line as well.
yep.
So he's consolidated a great deal of
Although
support.
Jamie Dimon has not been positive about the tariff situation, he's been quite vocal in his non-support of the tariff situation, saying
Does it
it's going to
matter?
lead to a global recession, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think he can move the needle, though. Obviously, in
No,
this
on his
situation.
own, what difference does it make? The dog can bark and the caravan still moves on. I think what we're starting to see is a United States that looks distinctly un-American in the 21st century. In a way, it's a kind of techno autocracy that seems to
Yeah,
be emerging.
or
And I think there's some
techno-feudalism,
broad
right?
consent that that's what it's going to take, right? Because they're going to have to displace an awful lot of workers and a lot of people who are used to voting and having a say. And they're going to say, nope, we're going to reset the global economic order, and you're going to take orders from us now. You're going to comply. We're also seeing kind of a strange, heavy-handed, policy where police officers or law enforcement officers of some branch, unnamed branch, are appearing without badges, snatching people off the streets and so forth. These are kinds of scenes that we would have expected to see in a dictatorship.
A gulag
Right here,
approach.
now, any
Yeah.
kind of remark, people are kind of letting it go by. It's becoming normalized, I think, and I find this very disturbing because the America that emerges on the other side of this might not be the America that we grew up in. Well, at least I did. You didn't grow up in this one.
But I think this is really the inflection point I'm talking about. We do have a big philosophical shift coming. The role of work in society. When you have highly autonomous operations. What that means for people who can't work. When you have very high rates of unemployment because you've
Hmm.
been displaced by technology. We know that this is coming, and I know we've debated this many times about the ability of the economy to, create new jobs and so forth. But this requires massive investment in preparing for that shift. And we're not seeing that investment taking place. We're not seeing investment in climate mitigation taking place. We're not seeing the sort of investment we need in energy, next generation energy systems taking place. So we know that it's much more likely at this point that as these forces come into play on a geopolitical and global economic basis, there's much more likelihood that the US system is going to have some sort of structural collapse because it hasn't adapted fast enough.
When you say American system, political system or economic system, or both?
Both, I would say, right? Because they're both
That's scary.
clearly tied into each other. So but this is humanity. We don't look at the vaccine argument right now and what's happening in that space. And we suddenly had this spike in measles cases around the world, particularly in the West, though.
Yeah,
And you
two people
have,
have died of measles
yeah,
in Texas.
of a curable disease, a disease that was functionally cured, more than, well, many, many years ago, right? Decades ago. And so you have this situation where we have short memories. And then when it comes to, we have short memories about the Smoot-Hawley Act and these sort of things. But when it comes to what's going to happen next, in terms of technology-based unemployment, Musk has been talking about it for many years now, talking about universal basic income. Bill Gates is saying we have to tax robots and AI so that we can pay for UBI. These entrepreneurs know where this is going, but we've seen nothing in Congress. We've seen no working groups looking at this problem, trying to figure out how we might make that transition to this type of society. You've got technology going like this in terms of its capacity to inflict change on society, and policy is sort of like barely moving.
Yeah.
So that's the real problem we've got right now, is that exponential growth in technology versus policy adaptation, because we sort of sit there and say, well, we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure that that's going to happen. So, but when it happens, we'll have to respond. The problem
And that's
is that
the problem
when
with
it does
democracy.
happen,
It can only react. It's very poor at projecting or forecasting or anticipating. It can only react. But the
so
pace of
autocratic
change is so
systems may do better in that environment. That's the key
yeah,
problem, right?
because the pace
You
of
know?
change is so fast right now that by the time we see the evidence, whatever remedy they come up with, the progression of technology will have exceeded it. So they'll forever be playing catch up. But what I don't understand is, how does that serve everyone else? Or is this just the oligarch's game? Is this a rich man's game now, where the rich men are going to pick up all the pieces, grab as many as they can, and basically try to renegotiate the rules of society? My
Mm.
fear is that what we're going to end up with is a country, the United States, is going to come out of this poorer and less healthy and also less secure in terms of national security and defense. And there may be people who emerge much wealthier
Yes.
from this, but it's a tiny number, and there'll be a massive number of people who need help, and they're not going to get it because those systems are being dismantled right now. At least that's what it looks like today in
Right.
April of
It's going to look a
2025.
lot more like Russia than it does look historically like the United States.
And
Um,
when I went to Russia a couple of years ago, I visited with someone there who said Russia. They said 10% of Russia lives like Switzerland, meaning rich people, and 10% lives like Italy, meaning mafia, and 80% live like Africa, meaning dirt
yeah.
poor. And honestly, it's true. If you get 100 miles outside of Moscow, you're on dirt roads, and they don't necessarily have
Mm.
sanitation. It's about as primitive as it can get. I know that sounds like a dire prognosis, and I'm the last person who's going to suggest that's what we're heading for. But we do see United States with crumbling infrastructure, and there's no real initiative underway to try to repair that or improve it. It seems to me we can't even get a fire response here in California
Yeah.
figured out.
Well, there's no
So
social contract either, right? Because if you
none.
think about it, like, we're talking about attacking Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Yeah, they're going to
Um, you
dismantle
know,
the supports that
yeah.
are there.
But every other developed nation on the planet has universal healthcare, universal education available for all of their citizens, and that's worked, for decades now. The US is an outlier in that respect, but Russia's sort of an example of that as well. So I think, if you have a system that's powered by things like Citizens United and the lobbying groups and so forth, it's going to be very, very hard to dismantle those sort of control mechanisms that where the big wealth can sort of make those changes.
Yeah,
How do
that's
you
another
get,
accelerating outcome,
yeah,
right? It's a compounding of wealth, and we've seen that now. Just in our lifetime, we've seen that the super wealthy are getting even more wealthy. Uh, this is a fearful outcome to me. This is not the happy prognosis we were looking for.
and
Where
we might celebrate that an American is the first trillionaire, for example, right? As a milestone like that might, but in reality, what does that mean functionally at the economy level for the average, American? It means that there's no middle class anymore. You just have a lower class, you have stratification of the rich and the poor, and the UBI is not going to really help with that. The UBI is like, here, we'll give you enough to survive, while we have amassed all this wealth with artificial intelligence and so forth. Whereas the potential of this next generation of science and technology to bring about real longevity, to bring
Yeah.
about real quality of life changes because of widespread automation, that is not going to be evenly distributed in a system where you have that sort of element of control. It looks more like the Middle Ages in terms of economics than it does the 1960s America, which everyone sort of wants to get back to, right?
Well, it's a myth, right? What they want to go back to, it can't come back. There's no way we're
Mm.
going to have, 400,000 people working at auto factories in Detroit. That's over. That's the
Yeah.
past. What you're describing is capital biased technological change. And it's a real serious possibility. I think regardless of the shenanigans that are happening right now in Washington and the motivations for that, that's been the agenda for the last 20 years. This idea that the technological change that comes is biased towards capital and against labor or working people. I think we've seen that in the disparity of wealth and the disparity of income. I think it's going to accelerate. That's going to increase. So
Let's
in a way,
actually, Rob.
exponential technology actually creates exponential wealth disparity.
Yes. Let's play a little game. All right. Let's do the futurist thing right now because we're leading up to the end of the show. But what would be a scenario where the US middle class would balloon and average wealth would be distributed much better to the broad American populace? Like, what could actually make that happen? If this isn't going to make that happen, what do you think could make that happen? How would we need to restructure the economy?
It's a really interesting question. So, Brett, right now I'm starting a company, and in the company that I'm starting, we hired a head of product who's great. And last month I was speaking to him. I said, "Hey, how many people did you have working for you in the past?" And he said about 10 or 11 people, depending on what projects he was working on. And I said, "In this company, how many will you need?" And he said, "Actually, I'm interested in using AI to automate all the job functions. I don't think I'll need anyone else." So one person can do the work of 10 or 11 in just a couple of years ago, right? So that's a change. What that says to me is that the cost of starting a company has plummeted. We've known that, right?
Yep.
Cloud did that.
Barriers to
Open
entry
source
much
software
lower.
did that.
Yep.
So the idea then is that there should be a lot more entrepreneurs who take advantage of technologies in order to create their own employment. Don't look for a job. Don't rely on a union. Don't go work for the factory, but instead create your own business. Maybe it is a factory. Maybe it's driven largely by AI. We can already see that the AI technologies that are on the market, they're going to have a very tough time avoiding getting commoditized themselves, right? These big AI models,
Yes.
they're all converging on similar functionality. And now you've got open source models from China that come along. Some of them are derived from those same models, but these are open
Sure.
source. They're going to put pricing power in jeopardy. They're going to really limit the ability to extract a high profit margin from these AI technologies. The big companies are trying to bundle it into cloud so they can preserve their margin on the cloud. That's a smart strategy for a big company. But an independent AI company, that technology is vectoring towards very low cost, like the cost of compute. So that means that AI technology is going to be available as a force multiplier for entrepreneurs around the world very soon, like now, not like
Mm.
next year, this year, right? And with agentic software, if provided that you can create agents, this is not something that's given to everybody, but it's getting easier and easier. You've seen, things like Cursor, tools like Cursor that allow you to vibe code your way to kind of like hack out a
And
model.
minus.
Whether or not
Yeah.
that's secure is unknown. Right now, it seems like it's a little bit sloppy. Those will improve over time, meaning it's beginning to confer on a larger number of people the ability to write software to automate functions themselves without the need for huge amounts of capital. So when you ask me, where do I see the ray of light? Where do I see the light at the end of the tunnel? It's this path. It's towards empowering a new generation of entrepreneurs who create new businesses from scratch using automation that's available off the shelf, that's priced as a commodity in order to create superpowers to do the job of 10 or 12 people.
And UBI, while it's got its problems, people who receive UBI start their own businesses at 300% higher rate or three times the rate of the general population because they don't have to worry about, their day job to make ends meet. So, there could be a combination of this, leveraging automation to create that sort of high quality of life across society and provide that. A few years ago, I heard someone said that we're never going to be able to have the quality of life that Americans and Western Europeans have across the planet on the current basis of resources we have. Well, I recently learned that there was a study that was done on this, and it was that only 35% of global GDP would need to be deployed properly in order to create that sort of global quality of life for 9 billion people. So the reality is, when we say that, that's not accurate. We could have a good quality of life for every human on the planet with our current technological state. AI is going to improve that dramatically. The problem we have is wealth disparity right now. And that's the problem we have to fix in order to take humanity the next level. And that's what I think is the motivation behind these tariff wars and this attack on the system right now, is that they know that that system is coming to an end. And it's a mechanism to grab as much power and as much wealth as possible before it all goes tits up. Excuse my French.
Well, I was going to say a moment ago, the UBI scenario, the fly in the ointment there is all the entities that are going to seek to extract rent from that, right? So one would be landlords, just to use the example that presents itself, right? Rents will go up in line with UBI. So suddenly, if it costs $5,000 a month, it'll go up to $7,000 a month, and they'll just take the UBI money as part of the rent. But that's not the only.
Housing needs to be a community function for 80% of the population.
Yeah,
just,
and that would be true for technological infrastructure, transportation, whatever is required for that scenario of massive numbers of entrepreneurs creating their own businesses and so forth. Now, who's going to govern that? And that says we need more government, not less. And I think this is true. This is what Peter Drucker always said.
Well,
in a technological
why can't
future,
we use
need more
AI
government, not less.
agency? Why can't we use AI agency for governance? I mean, okay, there's an issue.
Had a great example of that. These tariffs were set by an AI, and they were literally the dumbest thing. It's not artificial intelligence; it's artificial stupidity. So we had a brilliant example of how not to use AI. Maybe someday, but not yet. And honestly, these systems aren't trustworthy enough. I would not say that. I mean, you deal with the credit card companies. Visa's already said they're not going to empower agents to do transactions with Visa credit cards, because there's going to be so many flaws.
Well, we haven't trained them on financial data yet, right? That's the problem. Is ChatGPT, Claude, these things have not been trained on financial transactions. They
blew up the economy, and yet the systems that we're talking about for the future aren't really mature enough yet, and we haven't really done the work to figure out how they might work. And there isn't really a good framework here for governance. I think it's a big missing piece of the equation. While they're rapidly dismantling the existing governance. Now, the people, the people who hold a piece of power or can bite off one corner of that equation, they're going to maximize that and try to extract as much as they possibly can. So we're going to need someone to come with a sledgehammer and beat that down. And I'm talking about banks, and I'm talking about tech companies, and I'm talking about food companies, and and landlords, big real estate trusts. So I don't see this particular government making an effort to undo any of that. I don't think that'll be the next government, if there is one.
Well, I think what's clearly going to happen is this isn't going to work. Trump may get some trade concessions and so forth. The reality is it's not going to result in significantly better quality of life for the average American. It's likely going to be exactly the opposite to that. Does that bring us to a point, for the next election, for example, where we say populism hasn't worked, the democratic model in the old world hasn't worked, who could propose something new and radical that would get enough support from the populace to have a chance of moving ahead?
But this is where I have to tell you, I'm so stunned, because the Democratic Party is acting all hurt and shocked and dismayed and in disarray, when this looks like a golden opportunity for them to develop a new message, which is, what is the governance mechanism after the wrecking ball? They're not answering that question. And honestly, if they were in power today, or if they win some power back in the midterm elections in 2 years, exactly what they're going to do. They're going to try to restore what was there. They're going to try to go back to all the systems that were just dismantled.
That's not going to work.
They're going to waste a lot of time stepping backwards in time. Right now, if there were
If you
visionary leadership,
if you're listening to this and you think that Robert and I are radical lefties, let's be clear: we're not proposing that the left is going to solve this problem either. We need new thinking. We need new human philosophy, and that's what this is teaching us right now: is that we need new thinking. And AI can be a part of the solution set, but the systems that we built during the Industrial Revolution, the education system that we built, the economic system we built, it is not fit for purpose for what's coming. That's probably a good way to finish the show.
great. Well, then, you've been listening to The Futurists with Brett King and myself, Rob Tercek. Each week, we try to bring you a group of people who are thinking about and shaping and influencing the future with their actions. This week was a special edition because we felt the urgent need to talk about these big changes that are underway. Of course, we're going to come back with more on this story in the future because this scenario has certainly not come to a complete end. So watch this space. But in the meantime, we would love to have you come back next week. Send us your suggestions for speakers. Send us your suggestions for topics. We've enjoyed bringing those folks onto the show and asking the questions that you send to us. So please definitely do that. And we'll be back next week with another futurist. And until then, Brett, you know what we always say at the end of the show. Until then, we'll see you.
We'll see you in the future.